Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Paul Demeray, and I have the pleasure of spending some time today with Mark Schneider, the CEO of Nestle. Prior to being CEO of Nestle, where he was appointed in 2016, Mark was the CEO of Fresenius, a global health group. During his time as CEO at Fresenius, he increased the employee count by more than 3 times, quadrupled revenues, and grew profit 12-fold. And so clearly an incredible corporate leader who happens to also be extremely mission-driven. And I could only hope for the shareholders of Nestle that he accomplishes the same in this new role. But ultimately, I think he's looking to accomplish even more than that. So Mark, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for taking the time. As a first question, you are the first outside CEO of Nestle since 1922. Why is it that Nestle went and found you? And what do you think are some of your past experiences that made you the ideal person for this role and this challenge?
Thanks, Paul. And let me just say it's a pleasure and honor here to be part of this conversation with you. My regrets I can't be with you on stage in person. Would have loved to do that, but alas, I think COVID kind of made that hard to accomplish. When it comes to Nestle, I mean, fair question, probably one that's better asked to our board of directors. From my side, more than meets the eye. This was a company that knew me well before my appointment, and I knew them. Both my previous employer, Fresenius, and Nestle are engaged in the medical nutrition field. And so I've known the Nestle leadership for more than 10 years before I was appointed, and hence I had a good sense of that corporate culture and their approach to business. And they knew essentially what we were doing at Fresenius, and I think respected that as well. So in that sense, it was a gradual process where we saw that we were quite compatible in our approach to business. And it also made that transition from Fresenius to Nestle easier because I knew the key people. I knew that in that culture, I was going to be happy and productive. And this is the way it turned out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. You were appointed in 2016, began at Nestle in 2017. Entering the group, what were some of your priorities? What were some of the things that you wanted to achieve early on, and have those things been achieved? And how has spending, I guess, 4 years now in the group maybe changed your view on what are some of the priorities that are important?
Yeah. And of course, this is now a very different day and age with different priorities in 2021 and in COVID times. But it's important to take a step back to the years 2015, 2016, and to look at the situation of large consumer goods companies at that time. And it was a time when we were seeing a largely deflationary environment in key developed markets, coupled with an onslaught of startup companies and focused companies with an amazing rate of innovation, often using digital business models and collectively taking market share from the larger companies. The larger companies, including us, have been too much focused on just holding market share stable relative to their large competitors. And I think all of them had kind of missed out on that significant innovation triumph that happened with the smaller companies. So job number one was to crank up the innovation engine, speed up the rate of innovation, the flow of new products and exciting products to market, reinvigorate some of our key brands in the process, and just igniting consumer enthusiasm, and also reducing the time from concept to store shelf. And I think that is the largest inside change that we've done to the company. I think it's been, by and large, quite successful. The other part is there has been a period of fairly intense buying and selling, trading out of some positions where we did not see good long-term fit or growth prospects, and then trading into some key promising area, most notably in the nutritional health space.
So touching on your topic of innovation, what operational or what organizational changes did you do in Nestle, which I guess was running successfully for many years? So what kind of change management did you bring to the company in order to drive that innovation? Did you centralize innovation more? Did you decentralize innovation more? Did you make it local? What are some of the things that you did to make that happen?
So we've traditionally had the largest R&D budget in the industry at about 1.7 billion Swiss francs. Compared to the size of the budget, I felt that there was just not enough of a flow of new and exciting products, and that products sometimes were taking too long to market. And in the food and beverage space, it is possible, and small companies have shown this, that you can bring a new product from concept to shelf in 6 months. And this is not high tech, this is not healthcare, this is not IT. And so it was important to weed out the processes that were not conducive to that timeline, and really, streamline everything and split it up. So on the same budget, it's still about the same amount today. I think we're getting now so much more exciting products and a faster timeline, and also very, very good pipelines here going forward for our key categories.
Could you give us an example of one type of process that you were able to weed out to accelerate that pipeline?
Yeah, so for example, it makes a difference whether you just do a minor renovation on a product and basically update the packaging or the design, or whether you do a complete top to bottom redesign or even invent something totally new. And the process before was pretty much a one size fits all. It had more than 100 steps, a lot of them related to product quality, to be sure that whatever we bring to market is absolutely pristine. And of course, that's something we wouldn't want to touch. But if you only do a minor redesign, if you never touch the core of the product, then clearly it's not necessary to go through all of these steps. So we streamlined the whole process, made it more variable depending on how much you're actually changing, and reduced the overall number of steps, and got it down to something that is so much more streamlined and faster.
It's a fascinating example of how legacy bureaucracy and processes can sometimes shackle innovation in companies. Thank you for sharing that.
Perhaps one thing, so that's the front end of the engine. And then, of course, when it comes to the market-facing activities, there's also a culture change here that I was very supportive of, and that is more of a trial and error. The traditional consumer goods marketing mindset was develop something to perfection and then go for a big bang launch and then just watch it fly out of the ballpark. And these days, it's much more trial and error, rapid testing of new ideas and then adjusting on the fly. And then literally every few months making minor adjustments based on real data performance in the market with real consumers paying for the product with real money. So less focus groups, less designing to perfection, but more like adjusting on the fly as you see consumer preferences change.
I love that. It's the lean startup, agile kind of methodology, which is fantastic.
Absolutely.
Many current trends that I think we're all observing, and I think we're observing these trends across many industries, but specific to your world, the growth of farm to table, dietary preferences changing very quickly, local food, concerns over nutrition. How do you take a company that I'm sure has built itself around scale and global distribution and make that local and segment-based, and at the same time authentic? And many of the brands that you've been acquiring recently are very authentic brands. And so how do you manage that tension between the need for often scale for profitability and also the kind of growing trends towards hyper-segmentation and local?
Yeah. Fascinating question. And let me say, there's sometimes a misperception about Nestle because people associate us only with our key, what we call billionaire brands. So brands that sell more than $1 billion per annum. And in fact, when you drill down into Nestle, we're talking more than 2,000 brands globally. So we have 34, 35 billionaire brands, that stand for about 40-50% of our revenues. But then there's a super long tail end of local brands or regional brands that really have a lot of meaning for people locally, but we will never have the intention of scaling them up to a global level. For the global brands, I think these days the name of the game is capitalizing on the trust and the fact that these brands are well known, but still localizing. So let me give a good example. Nescafe, soluble coffee. So ultimately one of our key global brand names. What we're doing more and more is using the name so that people have the consumer trust, 80 years of unsurpassed quality, but then localize it on the label, like make it clear that, for example, for Mexico, this is coming from Mexican coffee beans that has been processed in Mexico, even sometimes featuring the farmers on the label. So it's kind of a global and local approach at the same time. And I think this is appealing to this local connectivity that seems to be more and more important.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that, and really, really interesting. One of the things you've mentioned in the past is good food starts with agriculture. You run a very long supply chain and a supply chain that has had its risk. I think Kit Kat, 20 years ago had an issue with certain oils that were, ending up hurting monkeys and things like this. How do you manage that risk, and how do you manage your supply chain in a world where everybody's looking for that traceability, that ethical sourcing?
Yeah. So supply chain is key in many different ways. And you're absolutely right when it comes to traceability and when it comes to this digital world around us. There's no place to hide. So if there's a problem, it'll be visible immediately. And supply chain, you have to approach that from two ends. One is the product quality side. So the consumer needs to have absolute faith that we leave no stone unturned to deliver pristine product. And then the other side is what you talked about, and that is our environmental practices. So, for example, when it comes to palm oil, to be sure that this is deforestation free and that, habitats for monkeys and other species do not get diminished. Human rights, when it comes to avoiding child labor, the environmental footprint, CO2 emissions, other greenhouse gas emissions. And that is one that we have put very much of a focus on recently. So we have an overall regeneration theme, and we're very much supportive of regenerative agriculture. And of course, we make sure that every step of the way, our farmers and the people who supply us comply with our principles. We're not just putting demands to them, we're also giving lots of technological assistance and financial assistance to be sure that they can step up to the quality level that we require.
And how do you balance those efforts with margin? Because often, some of those regenerative techniques you don't associate with scale agriculture, and scale agriculture you ultimately associate with lower costs. How do you balance the two? Do you assume that your clients are going to be able to accept higher pricing, or, as you mentioned, are some of the technological improvements that you are able to bring to those farmers so great in terms of productivity enhancement, where there is actually not a trade-off? The farmer is able to adapt and remain competitive, and you're able to remain competitive in terms of your prices.
So the way we see it, there's always exceptions, but by and large, most of this is an investment in the future towards future-proofing the business and making sure that we stay in the good book of today's informed consumer for the long run. If you don't do that, if you fall out of favor, you pay for it with diminishing sales and margins in the future. So in that sense, investments in this area are not that different from research and development, where, yes, of course, any dollar you spend now is a burden to the current quarter, but it's also an investment in the future in the sense that you want to have exciting products to sell down the road. The way we see it with this digital transparency on supply chain and environmental practices, depending on how a product is positioned, if it's more premium, lots of consumers these days are willing to pay something extra for a super clean environmental track record. And for the ones where they may not be able to pay more, basic or value products, nonetheless, environmental awareness is on the rise. And if someone else is basically offering a better track record, people might switch to that supplier and to that brand. and hence you would be risking losing business down the road. When you look at the younger generation today, across all geographies and basically around the world, the younger, the better educated, and the more affluent, the higher you'll find environmental concerns on their wish list. It's no longer just a fringe movement. I mean, this is mainstream, and I think it also gets copied and emulated by other age groups. And hence, this is the new consumer, and we have to live up to their expectations.
Are you able to give us an example of something interesting that you did at the kind of, farm level in terms of technology or in terms of assistance to the farmer's business model that you could share with us?
Yeah. So look, we have literally hundreds of agronomists on the ground in our various categories. So take coffee as an example, that work with coffee farmers directly and help them improve their yields. We do basic research into new and more climate-resistant coffee seeds, and we hand out those. We provide financial assistance when it comes to changing practices on your farm. In most of the cases, when you switch to regenerative farming practices, there tends to be an initial investment need, and then there's usually a 1 or 2 or 3 year dip in output before you kind of get back to where you came from. And of course, for a small-scale farmer, that's a significant step, and we can't just say, do it. I think we have to provide that help on the ground. So coffee is one of these signature categories where I think we have been putting a lot of help on the ground, making it available to people. I think what sets Nestle apart from many other food and beverage companies is that we do deal with the farmer directly in many cases. To give you a sense, we source dairy from 110,000 farmers around the world. And when it comes to all of our agricultural commodities, we deal directly with almost 700,000 farmers around the world.
Wow. Fascinating. Maybe going to the other end of the supply chain, one of the things that, has been happening but was very much accelerated, I think, in COVID is, the last mile part of the supply chain with things like Just Eats and Uber Eats. And in Montreal, we have a company called Good Food that I use and has transformed my diet because all of a sudden I receive these boxes with everything I need to make a meal. And I believe you acquired a business called Freshly that I think is in that space as well. Why did you decide to play in that segment of the supply chain? And how are those changes impacting your business?
Yeah. So I think COVID was the coming of age of all things digital in food and beverage. Food and beverage traditionally was one of the slower adopters of digital practices compared to books and consumer electronics and a few other categories. But I think now, under the stress of COVID and over the pandemic and sanitary concerns, I think a lot of people that were initially resistant to do their food and beverage purchasing online have now switched towards that. Traditionally, what we used to say before COVID is consumers like to pick bananas by themselves and just want to be sure they get, good products, especially for fresh products. But I think now they have really graduated to that level, and retailers around the world online have stepped up. And I think now people have discovered the convenience of just shopping online and getting things delivered. And then when it comes to meal boxes or ready-made meals, I think people also appreciate the convenience of having that delivered to their homes. Initially, when there was the pandemic lockdowns, obviously people had a lot of time. There was a lot of scratch cooking. But then as soon as things opened up and people were not bored anymore, clearly we're still under the same time pressures as before the pandemic, but we're spending more time at home. And so having offerings that actually bring the food to your home and make it easy for you to enjoy a freshly made meal without, cooking from scratch. I think that is something that is pretty much in demand. We call it the home canteen in a sense. Yeah. Before the pandemic, we used to go to the offices and have our lunches 5 times a day at the canteen. Now, for the time that we do spend at home, we need some sort of option here that saves you time, nonetheless makes sure that it gets something fresh in front of you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. One of the big topics that, is a topic environmentally globally is the topic of plastic. And you are a big producer of bottled water, which is, an industry that seems to be going under some transformation. If I look at the amount of offices that are banning bottled water, it's a growing kind of number. How do you think about that business model? And are there opportunities to transform the bottled water model into something else, just given the scale you have in some of the most important brands in the space?
Yeah. So generally, we are committed to the business of what we call healthy hydration. I think if you're interested in public health and asking people to drink more, but not in the form of carbonated soft drinks, I think the water business is a beautiful business to be in. And what I love about it is, we've been really riding a long-term trend here, going back to the early 1990s. Finally, in the year 2016, per capita consumption of bottled water in the United States surpassed carbonated soft drink consumption. And so we've really been riding a long-term trend that I think was a great business opportunity and also contributed to public health. The container strategy is a key question. Yes, the standard choice 10, 20 years ago was the PET bottle, almost no other alternatives considered. I think now what you have is a much more nuanced world where, yes, clearly, if you spend all day long in an office, why use a bottle all the time? Why not, use a refillable container and have something that's served on the spot? But if you go on a trip in a car, train, or plane or whatever, a resealable container is still a very good option.
Yeah.
And that boils down to not so much which material are you using, but what is the end-of-life strategy for that material, i.e., is there some good recycling system available, yes or no? And so where we do business, we're all in favor of establishing a recycling infrastructure. We have a commitment out there to make all of our packaging material reusable or recyclable by the year 2025. We are on a good track towards that. And so we're firmly committed to being part of the solution.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. At Fresenius, and even since you've become CEO of Nestle, M&A has been a big part of your strategic toolkit. You have done a lot of acquisitions in the past. How are you thinking about acquisitions today? You bought Blue Bottle Coffee, a few kind of other niche brands. How do you go about identifying these, and then how do you go about making sure that the reasons why you purchased them remain alive once they've been incorporated in your organization?
Yeah. And Paul, I know you're in the investing business, and let me just make a general statement up front. As a corporate buyer and seller, you should not attempt to trade your way to glory. So buying and selling, even at times when it happens at an accelerated pace, should be done really prudently, because compared to an investment firm, our trading costs are significantly higher. So when we buy something, there's going to be a fairly complex integration process that follows the deal. And usually when we buy something, we also pay a control premium, not just the quoted share price or price per unit. When we sell, there's a complex carve-out that's necessary to trade the asset. And so all the more reason here on both sides to act very prudently. There is no day trading here. When we commit to something, we should commit to it for long periods of time. Now, to your question on integration, if you buy something that still very much requires what I call the entrepreneurial drive and spark, then you have to think about a gradual process where you incentivize some of the key people to stay on, give them some freedom, have some governance around them that gives them wiggle room, and then over time sort of see, in a several-year process, that this company sort of finds its way into your business, but don't force it day one, because that would risk killing all of that drive and ambition. If you buy a unit that has been a corporate unit before, where some of the processes and the culture may be very similar to what you practice inside your firm already, you may be able to go for a more straightforward traditional integration process. So it comes down to a case-by-case evaluation. I think this is, to me, one of the key things when we look at targets. I mean, in addition to all the valuation work and the strategies you look at, you try to get a sense of, okay, what sort of integration process am I going to aim for? And then, of course, you want to have some sort of understanding with the key people behind that company so that there's no surprise the day after you sign.
Super helpful. Thank you so much for that. I had an interesting experience this weekend where I went to McDonald's and they had run out of Diet Coke. And it seems that in today's world, going to a restaurant or going into a grocery store or any store and hearing that they've run out of the item that you're there for is becoming more and more common. What is happening in global supply chains, and how long do you think these disturbances are going to last? And what do you think is the solution to this?
Yeah. So when you look at this 2-year history of COVID and what it meant to corporate leaders, then clearly 2020 was all about health and safety, keeping your people in a safe space, making sure that you keep the business running. But now 2021 is clearly dominated by supply chain discussions. And I'm hardly aware of any industry where that's not an issue. And it starts with global shipping, where clearly after a year of COVID, it seems all the world's containers ended up in the wrong place. And there's also been some capacity that have been initially decommissioned and kind of is slow to come back in. It extends to labor shortages, like people finding it hard to get back into the workforce, trucking shortages. So even at the domestic level, it's pretty hard to ship your products. And then there's also at times various key ingredients that might be in short supply, and then you basically work the phones and have to be sure you get your fair share or more than that. So it's been a very intense time on our supply chain folks, and we're all working hard and scrambling to keep disruptions at a minimum. But yes, I mean, that's a global problem right now. I think some of that will probably relax itself as you give it another 6 months to a year, because clearly there is a bit of a post-COVID hiccup. And then there may be a few more fundamental things at work that may extend longer. But to what extent this is a blip or kind of a longer-term thing, I think right now it's anyone's guess.
Fascinating. One industry that's going through a big supply chain transformation is the meat industry, with the growth of plant-based meats. You've also made, I believe, a few plays in this space. Why is this a good business? Why is plant-based meats ultimately not going to become just a commodity business when Nestle has such a reputation for brands that are kind of differentiated? What makes plant-based meats not like chicken breasts?
Yeah. So I do believe it's a significant opportunity, and one that we summarize with good for you, good for the planet. Good for you in the sense that in most Western countries, we're way over-indexed in our meat consumption, and hence having more plant-based alternatives available and having a more balanced diet, I think, has huge public health and individual health benefits. And good for the planet in the sense that these plant-based meat alternatives are usually much lower when it comes to their greenhouse gas emissions. So on a standard hamburger patty, depending on the study you look at, for the same size, same weight patty, we're talking 70–80% less greenhouse gas emissions. Is it a commodity? I believe no, because clearly as you sample different products, when it comes to taste and mouthfeel, and when it comes to the nutritional value of the product, I mean, there's clear differences here. And of course, what we aim at is, when it comes to taste and mouthfeel, be as close as possible to the original, but then also be sure that from a nutritional point of view, that you beat the original product. So lower calorie count, less saturated fat, identical protein content, and issues like that. That's something we're working on. Ultimately, I think there will be winners and losers on this, and consumers recognize it, because some of them taste like cardboard and others are just delicious.
And are there other categories that are going through similar transformations? Like, is there going? I mean, if I think of milk, and you're a world leader in, I guess, baby food and baby milk powders, is the baby milk powder industry going through kind of similar types of transformations?
I think the two key ones right now are all sorts of meat analogs. So beef, chicken, pork, even seafood is on the menu. So I think that one is a big deal right now. Then you have plant-based dairy analogs, and I think those are important not just as a straight dairy replacement, but also think about chocolate confectionery and ice cream and some other ingredients or products that use dairy as an ingredient, even coffee creamers. So many cups are drunk white, especially in Canada. So I think that's a big deal. When it comes to infant nutrition, frankly, I think this is one of those areas where cow's milk does have some significant advantages. And so, yes, over time, we may be exploring opportunities here, but I think this is an area where the real thing still has its rightful space.
Diversity and inclusion is a huge topic in North America, and I understand that in Europe there are different regulations that make it more gender-based and race-based. What is Nestle doing in terms of diversity inclusion in its workforce in different geographies, and what are some of the lessons that you've learned that some of our listeners can maybe learn from?
Yeah. It is a huge issue, and I think it is global because clearly for a global firm, just saying, well, the rules are a little different in Europe or in Asia, frankly, that's a fairly meek excuse. On many of these items, aside from all regulations, it's also about correcting historic wrongs and just doing the right thing. And certainly applies to gender and ethnic diversity and inclusion. And so, yes, we're very, very hard at work to promote, a sufficient number of females in our ranks to be sure that ultimately we get to equal gender participation. We're very active when it comes to having a good ethnic profile globally, and also, very hard at work when it comes to minority hiring and giving some of our local business to minority-owned business partners. So all of these issues, again, it's not only about the rules; it's also about just doing the right thing.
Yeah. It's interesting because you just mentioned minority partners in certain geographies. How do you think about that in terms of having, a non-Nestle partner in a business that you're looking to build? And could you give us an example of where that's worked really well for your organization?
I think in the U.S. in particular, when it comes to local community programs and some of the local products and services that we source from community-based suppliers, I think these location-based strategies, this is where it works best. You can always design national programs, but at the end of the day, it's around the immediate vicinity of your factories and office buildings and distribution centers where you consume lots of products and services that are provided on a local basis, where you have a choice and where I feel that you can make a significant difference for these communities.
Interesting. So supply chains are challenging, but the other thing that many companies are facing is many difficulty in attracting talent, especially talent that is innovation focused. What are you doing at Nestle, especially given what you mentioned earlier, your drive to drive more innovation, to attract those innovative thinkers when you're competing against Amazons, Googles, and many of the large technology companies in the world? How does Nestle, which is a very old established company, make itself appealing for these young people or older people?
Yeah. So look, obviously you try to improve your candidate intake, but let's not forget the existing group of associates around the world, and basically unshackling anything that stands in the way of more creativity, more trial and error, and more entrepreneurial thinking. So that to me is starting point number one. Then another thing that we watch very closely right now is retention, because obviously, yes, you want to be a competitive company out there when it comes to hiring people, but let's also be sure when it comes to retention that you're not losing them at a fast clip. And so, especially for the people that are your best performers, make sure that from a culture point of view and financial incentives, everything's up to date, and that you retain people to the best extent possible. When it comes to hiring these days, I think having a very flexible offering is key, in addition to, of course, a competitive financial package. So that's why, for example, in the aftermath of COVID now, flexible work arrangements, and looking at the future of work and opening up to remote work opportunities. I think that is very important to some of the best performers. It's also a good way to square work and personal life demands. And, in the old days, we spent so much time without thinking about just commuting to the office, commuting back. And these days, we all discovered that so many things can be done remotely, that I think around that, you will see work rules change pretty significantly.
Can you give us an example of something innovative that Nestle is doing around these types of future work programs?
So the way we worked it out is, rather than having one global policy here for a company that is present in 186 countries, I think what you're doing is you're issuing some guidelines, but then you have to leave some local latitude to how that's being implemented, because there will be in the future some environments that will be almost all remote, and there will be others that are still quite traditional, where it's important for people to come to the office, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. So that's why, the rules we gave ourselves at the global level are pretty much hybrid rules, rather than going just one way or the other. And then locally, people basically, among these, with the guidance of these guidelines, work it out and try to find a meaningful compromise.
Fantastic. My final question, we spoke about the supply chain, we spoke about talent, some of the work you're doing around ESG, responsible sourcing. Your past, as CEO of Fresenius, an incredible value creator. What are you most excited about accomplishing over the next 5 years? And what do you hope your legacy will be? And what do you hope to be remembered by in terms of your impact?
Okay, I get the legacy question quite often, and I have a pretty simple approach to this. It's not about my legacy, it's about Nestle and what Nestle is remembered for. If in 20, 30 years' time, people do not remember who was the CEO at this moment, but the company's in great shape, I'll be a happy man. And so it's about the business. We have a 155-year history, and we're fully intending to be around for a long time. And so basically doing my part at this time to be sure that this continues is key. And for the moment, I think this means fully taking advantage of all opportunities that are offered by this digital world around us. Digital looks like it's been around for 30, 40 years, but the full digital build-out of our society has just begun. And so there's endless opportunities. And then specifically for food and beverage and for nutrition, what it also means, digital allows you to personalize in greater ways than ever. And I think this is workspace that will keep us busy for 10, 15, 20 years easily. And it'll give us opportunities on the nutrition front that would not be thought realistic before. But personalization at scale, segment of one marketing, all of these pipe dreams that marketeers used to have for decades, I think now with digital, they become reality, and they will lead to better products, more premium products, and also better margins down the road.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. And if you're ever in Montreal, we would love to welcome you.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to join you for the conversation, and hope you have a great conference.
Thank you.